Alright, and welcome back again to Kerbal Space Program. I'm going to be doing this as post-commentary again today because I did some more satellite launches and stuff, and it was kind of time-consuming, and I did not want to actually show the whole thing. So I'm just going to do this as a post-commentary. As you can see here, we already got comm satellites around the Mun. They're kind of in the right orbit, kind of not, I guess. What am I showing here exactly? I think I'm mentioning that the old ISA satellite and the Kethane satellite that I have will no longer function. These are what I ended up putting in orbit of the Mun as far as the comm relay satellites. Basically, I was learning a lot about how the remote tech mod actually works at this point. If I had it all to do over again, I probably would have put 3 dishes on each satellite that I built, because it kind of ends up being a problem later. But I didn't know any better, so I just put 2. We'd focus 1 at Kerbal, 1 at Minmus. This way we'll have the range to hopefully launch stuff out to Minmus, is what I was attempting to do here. This is going to be the first time that we're really like needing to align dishes at each other, and that's kind of why I wanted to do this, is just to illustrate how that works. Alright, so we're going to be using the same launch vehicle basically that I used to put the satellites into orbit, to put them in the orbit of Kerbal and of the Mun. This is going to be sent out to Minmus. It's just 3 satellites on a rocket, basically. This should have the range. In fact, I know it does because this is post-commentary, but this rocket has the range to reach Minmus. We can drop these things off in kind of the orbit that we want, and then we'll use the ion engines that are actually on them to put them in their final orbits, and then make adjustments later, because I did not get the orbits perfect enough. Everything ends up getting out of phase eventually down the road, but that's something to worry about for later. So this is just a typical launch. It goes, perfectly well. So let's skip ahead until we actually do the transfer out to Minmus. Alright, I did want to actually include this part as well, because this was kind of a, like I said earlier, a learning experience for me. We're working on achieving orbit here. MechJeb's dealing with that, so I don't really have much to do there. But what I decided to do, so I didn't forget, because that was the main thing I was worried about, is forgetting to do this, is I'm going to take the time to actually target dishes at things. So hopefully, if I do all these dishes, we'll be able to stay in contact here. So we're just saying the first one's for Kerbal. I'm going to set the other ones for the Mun. Now, these have a range of like, I think it's like 50 million meters or something like that. And Minmus's orbit is out like past 50 million. So this ended up being a little bit of an issue, but as you'll see later, it'll end up working out. So I'm just going to target these dishes at 1 on each satellite, 1 at Kerbal, and then 1 at the Mun. And as you can see here, we're just using MechJeb to match the inclination of Minmus, since it's on sort of a weird plane. It's easier to get an encounter with it if you go ahead and match your plane with it first. So dealing with that, we're going to go ahead and get our intercept plotted and all that in a second here. And it's pretty much the same thing that I've done before, so we'll skip ahead until we actually are on our way out there. Alright, so at this point you can see we are still within comm range of Kerbal because of our fancy-dancy aiming the satellites ahead of time, so I didn't forget. The delays in the signal actually start getting pretty darn big out this way. As you can see there, it's like a third of a second. So already we're getting some pretty decent distances and some pretty decent signal delays. But we're coming up on our point to inject into orbit here, slow down a little bit, and just arrest our orbit here. Now, we're kind of in a weird plane still with relative to Kerbal, but I guess we're sort of on, I don't even know what Minmus's equator is at, but we're just going to go ahead and call this orbit good enough for our basic parking orbit, because we're going to have to do some phasing and stuff to get the satellites distributed from this correctly, as we'll see in a minute here. So it's a pretty, it's not a very long burn to get our Minmus orbit started here. This rocket actually has plenty of fuel to do all of this. I use it to deliver all my satellites within the Kerbal system, as you'll see later. I deployed those solar panels just in case I didn't want the thing going out of control, because you do use more power when you have these satellite dishes all active, so I wanted to make sure that we had enough power coming in that it wouldn't be a problem. So what am I doing at this point? I am changing my inclination. Okay, so I wanted these to just be at a 0 degree inclination because we're at kind of a funky inclination from coming in on that that transfer between Kerbin and Minmus. So just go ahead and fix that because I don't know why, it doesn't really matter. You can see our old ISA MapSat and Kethane satellite there. Those need to be replaced. So that's going to be on the list of things to do in this video as well. But let's just deal with this first. And I'm going to cut forward to where we start actually deploying satellite. Alright, so we're deploying our first satellite here. In the future, I'm going to do this more efficiently than I did in this. I learned a lot from this. I am only at an orbit of like 287 287 kilometers there. And that was kind of a mistake because these ion engines are not particularly thrusty, and I still had a lot of rocket fuel, so I should have gone into a higher orbit, at least on one side of the orbit, an elliptical orbit. That way I'd have a phasing orbit already established. It would have made this a lot easier to deal with, but I didn't do that. But it ended up working out well enough anyway. So this is our first satellite. I think I end up, what do I end up doing here? These don't have mech jeb on them or anything, so this is all manual actual control of the satellites. So I didn't really feel like putting mech jeb on every single satellite and stuff. So I'm just working on increasing the orbit. Out here at Minmus, these ion engines actually make a pretty big difference pretty quickly. It looks like, I think I went out to like 1,000,000 meters or so. I really don't remember. We'll see here in a second. But like I said, I'm not in any sort of phasing orbit, so it means every one of these satellites has to boost into its own orbit. It would have been better if I'd had one side of my orbit with my launch vehicle actually already at the desired altitude, the desired orbital altitude, because that would have actually made this go a lot quicker, but it doesn't really matter. Like I said, this is going to be time, I'm going to just cut stuff out anyway, so it won't matter to you, and I learned something for the future. So just finish this up. Are we going to 1,000,000 or 500,000? Let's see here. You can see the battery charge is doing all right, kinda, and we have plenty of xenon gas for this stuff. So it looks like it went to about 500,000 here, and I'm going to go ahead and just establish that orbit for this satellite, and then we'll figure out what to do with the next one in a second here. Alright, so we get that other orbit established. We're going to go ahead and extend the, well, I guess I'm retracting it just so nothing breaks, because these two are kind of close to each other. These ones always make me nervous with the launch. They kind of bump into each other and go a little, yeah, look at that. I don't know how that happened exactly, but it did, but nothing got broken, so we just need to time warp to kind of arrest the crazy spin. And like I said, these have ion engines on them, so it's not a big deal. I'm glad I folded up that solar panel, because that probably would have been bad if I hadn't. So what I'm going to do with this one is turn it around here, get those engines and panels and everything going here again. We need to get out to a phasing orbit with the other satellite, meaning an elliptical orbit with one part of the orbit being lower, and we're going to have the other part actually be our target orbit. That way we can actually catch up in the orbital, because I want to spread these out so they're about a third of the way around the planet. They don't end up being perfect, but they're close enough for, my purposes. I do have to make adjustments periodically. It seems like I can't get the orbits to be perfect enough. Like, it's been a problem later, especially around the Mun, where my satellites seem to just drift over time because the orbits aren't quite close enough, and I don't have mech jeb on any of these, like I said earlier, so it's a little hard to tell exactly what the actual orbital numbers are for the satellites. So you got to get them close, and like I said, it's got lots of xenon gas on it. I can make a lot of adjustments before they're going to run out of gas, so it'll probably be fine. It only ended up being a problem a couple of times, and so I think it'll probably be alright. I made the orbits a little more precise later on, and I'm hoping, I haven't been able to see yet because it hasn't been long enough in time warp and stuff, that alleviates some of that. I think part of it is there's a built-in error anyway, because when the physics are on rails, I don't think it's exactly precise, so it might kind of mess things up. So we're just finishing out the last little bit of this burn here, and then we're going to time warp. This is a phasing orbit that we're in, well, nearly anyway right now, because when we are at this low point, we're moving at our fastest speed, which means that we're going to be orbiting more quickly than the satellite that's already in its finalized orbit there. So we'll be able to actually change our relative orbits and our positions in those orbits. So you can see the satellite down there in the bottom of the screen. Right now, when we actually hit our apoapsis, we're about almost, it looks like about the right spot there. So, I mean, it's probably not exactly a third, but it's close enough. I'm happy with it. So we're going to swing this thing around, go ahead and finalize the relative orbit here, and should be pretty good then. And then I just have to repeat the process with the other satellite. Like I said, this would have been more efficient if I'd used the actual liquid-fueled engine, because it has a lot more power, but around Minmus it's not such a big deal because the speeds are so low anyway. You can make a pretty big change pretty fast. And so that will work out, it looks like. The main thing is just that they're not too close together so that we can always have a line of sight of at least one of the other satellites, because then we should have decent coverage on the ground and never be blocked. And we are going to be sending some rovers out to Minmus. Minmus will probably end up being my primary fuel source because it's a lot easier to launch stuff off the surface of Minmus than it is from the surface of the Mun. I'm going to be doing a moon base and then a Minmus base eventually too, so I want to get all this infrastructure in the Kerbal system. And as you can see, the orbits aren't quite lined up right. I'll go ahead and fix that when we come around. It's a lot of finicky stuff. It's actually pretty boring. I'm just doing a little bit of phasing so I get it like more close to what I'd wanted it to be. See, our orbit's outside of the original satellite's orbit now, which means we're going a little bit slower, so it allows it to catch up with us. And I think on this orbit I was pretty happy with it being roughly right, so go ahead and finish that up. And so I'm just going to cut to after we've launched the next satellite and stuff, because it's exactly the same process as this. Alright, so at this point I'm just turning this thing around. I'm going to launch the last satellite off of it, and we're actually going to deorbit the rocket so that I don't have a bunch of space junk floating around, because I don't like space junk. Even though it's out here at Minmus, I still don't want it. It was more annoying at this point in the game because I was still playing in 0.19 where it would all show up on the main tracking station thing. There's actually a filtered system now, so the debris actually goes in its own little category and it actually bothers me less. Still don't want a lot of it around Kerbal because it slows things down, but you know, whenever I can, I have fuel on it, why leave it? So let's go ahead and just spin this thing around and crash it, because crashes are fun anyway. So yeah, I have like a half a tank of fuel left in this thing, so it's really not a big deal. Not even being particularly careful. I'm just turning around retrograde and we'll just fire the rockets. I don't really care that much where it goes. So there's nothing down there on Minmus for it to crash into or anything. And as you can see, it's going down pretty quick, but we really give it the beans here now, and there she goes. Looking forward to crashing things into every planet and moon eventually. That's kind of one of the goals. I ended up just having to delete those satellites, the other two that are still there, the ISA MapSat, because they were not compatible. I had no control over them at all because they didn't have any antenna on them. So I just ended up crashing those. I mean, deleting them, rather. Ending the flight. Because I couldn't crash them. Alright, so at this point we're just finalizing that orbit of the third satellite. As you can see, they're pretty well spaced out. I'm going to have to do a little bit of fiddling with each of their orbits to kind of perfect it, because they're not quite exactly the same, but I'll do that. You know, I ended up doing that off camera because it's a pretty time-consuming process of having to go to the periapsis and then warping around to the apoapsis and all that. So I didn't really want to do that on film, but we got this set up. So we should be able to communicate with anybody down there, any robots, anything like that. And we'll be able to get our ISA satellites launched up here in a little bit here. So that's actually what we're going to tackle next. And I always shut down the engines just to be on the safe side so I don't accidentally hit shift at some point and have things fly off somewhere that I didn't intend to. But there's a nice little view of Minmus, our nice little satellite. It's nice out there. So let's cut ahead to the Space Center again, back to the launch vehicle. And this is basically the same rocket I used to get the original ISA MapSat and Kethane sat out there around Minmus. It's just pretty basic stuff, except it's got the remote tech stuff on it now, so I can actually control it. I did have a little bit of an issue with this rocket, as we'll see when we're on our way out. I didn't put any sort of dish on it, and that became a problem. So lesson was learned from this rocket. It ended up being a recoverable mistake this time, but in the future it might not be. So I'm going to cut ahead, and this is just the same launch vehicle. No point showing this. See you guys on our way out there. Alright, so we were just cruising along at time warp here, happily on our way, blissfully unaware of any sort of potential problem. I actually sort of suspected this might happen. As you can see here in a second, we're kind of when we cross, yep, there we go, out of contact. I kind of thought this might happen. I was concerned about it, but we're on a trajectory that takes us to Minmus, where there is already a satellite there. So I'm hoping that what will happen is that we'll just come right back into contact. I should have just put a satellite dish on the actual rocket to be on the safe side, but I didn't. So this is how we're going to handle it. This obviously won't work for interplanetary stuff unless we already have some sort of relay system set up there, but we should be coming into range of Minmus's comms in a little bit here. Plenty of time to actually get into orbit and all that stuff, because we're gonna hang here for like start slowing down. And I always think you're not gonna get your encounter with Minmus because it's like so far away, but you always do, because look how slow we end up going when we get to this point. So Minmus goes and catches up, and we're back in contact. Everything worked out, and we should be able to get into a stable orbit without flying off to God knows where. So let's wait for the actual little change of sphere of influence to occur here. I usually like to manually do a lot of this time warp because things go awry from time to time. And switched over. Cool. So we'll just go ahead and establish our orbit, and then we'll see what happens next. So at this point, we've established our orbit at almost 400 kilometers. And what we're going to do here is just go ahead and change our inclination to be 90 degrees, because these satellites are both mapping satellites that need to be in 90-degree orbits. So I'm just going to use MechJeb, as I usually do, to do this sort of stuff, because it's more precise and a lot easier to do. And I've been launching a lot of satellites at this point, and I know some people consider MechJeb cheating. I don't, because in real life they use computers and stuff, and also I just didn't really want to deal with all this stuff manually. So it also handles the time warp, which is also handy. So let's just wait for the burn to go on here. And what we're going to end up doing with these satellites is launching them into just their orbit, and I'll probably I think I ended up adjusting the other ones so that they're kind of at 90-degree orbits relative to each other as well. So that way these do have the ability to relay signals down to the surface of the planet. I'm not really probably going to be doing that much at the poles, so I'm not going to be putting a lot of satellites out here. If I do any stuff at the poles, it'll probably have to be manned missions up to the poles, because I just, I don't feel like launching a full relay network out here. So these will help relay satellites to the higher latitudes and stuff. And MechJeb's just finishing up here. It doesn't take a huge amount compared to other planets to do these changes, which is always nice. And there we go. See, we're pretty happy with that. Now that we've reached our 90-degree inclination, we're going to swing around here and launch one of these satellites. I always like to be facing towards the program marker when I do this, because especially out here at Minmus, these speeds are so low that you actually do get a little bit of extra speed out of decoupling. So we're going to launch this ISA satellite first. And we're going to figure out what kind of orbit we're going to put it in here. Let's get those panels out. There's always something really, I don't know, kind of cool about decoupling stuff. I just like how it looks. Then it's floating away all majestically from the mothership like that. So, as you can see, the orbits of the 3 satellites that I have here already are kind of screwed up, so I'm going to have to fix those. I ended up fixing those later. But you can see I have like 3 distinct different orbital lines. Those should be blurred together to the point where you really can't see a difference in them, because that makes it work kind of better. Alright, so we finished up the orbit of the other satellite. What we're going to do here is get this Kethane satellite going in its orbit here. It looks like we're almost exactly in the same orbit still. So I want these to not be like tied up right next to each other. So we're going to do a little bit of warping here and so forth and so on. Alright, so at this point I'm attempting to figure out how to actually get this to pivot like that. So I'm setting it up so that it can be at a 90-degree relative to the other orbit. I don't know how to say exactly what I'm doing, but you can see there, I don't want them to be in the same orbit. So we're going to make the little bit of a change that's necessary. And out here in Minmus, it's really minuscule. You can see here, basically stop everything, and then it flips. And we're pretty close. I want to get that a little bit better, so I'm going to make an adjustment here after we get this set up. There's an airplane flying by right now. You can probably hear. So yeah, I'm just going to use this to try to plot that the rest of the way here. And it was a little bit confusing to try to get it to do what I wanted it to do. That's obviously not what I wanted it to do. So let's delete that, and we'll go ahead and go back to what it ended up inputting. Yeah, there we go. So I just had to change where it actually happened. And that looks pretty darn close to me. So we'll go ahead and get this burn done here. Swing around. And it's kind of even nicer to have MechJeb do a lot of this stuff out here, because we're dealing with stuff that has, at this point, only a third of a second delay. But MechJeb actually, as you can see there, it says MechJeb control up there. MechJeb does not have that delay because, in theory, according to any sort of logic, it's a computer program on the actual satellite, so it wouldn't have to wait for a signal back home to make an adjustment. You'd send it the command ahead of time of what you want to do, and then it just makes the adjustment. So MechJeb does not have that delay, which will probably be very handy when we start getting farther away to places like Duna and whatever in the future, because that makes a lot of sense. You don't want to be making those adjustments like with minutes of delay involved. That would be bad. I don't know what the delay is going to be out at Duna. In real life, I think on Mars it's like 15 minutes or something. The whole Kerbal system is scaled down, so I'm sure it's not that much, but it'll probably be fairly significant still. So now that the rocket has completed its work here pretty much, we can go ahead and ditch the actual rocket itself. What is going on here now? Is it making another adjustment, or am I... What are we doing here? Oh, I'm swinging around so I can decouple the satellite because I want to do it into the prograde marker. Okay, that's what I'm doing. I recorded this a while ago, so it's a little hard to remember everything I was doing here. So this is basically, at this point, just a case of decoupling the satellite, deploying its solar panels, and crashing the rocket as we usually would. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I was not able to do anything with the old ISA satellite or the old Kethane satellite that's already in orbit here. So I ended up just using the tracker station thingy to delete those flights because they were going to annoy me, and I can't retroactively put a radio on something. I guess I could if I edited the save, but I don't like cheating like that, so I just deleted it. We'll assume that they're just defunct and somewhere that they sent some sort of remote detonation command to them or whatever. But I wanted to make this episode just to show how I dealt with this stuff. This is probably going to be fairly standard to what we do with every planet and moon that we're going to be operating at. I'm still working on getting, in later episodes, a moon base set up, and then we're going to start venturing further out. So this is probably going to be pretty typical of that stuff. So anyway, everyone, I just want to thank you for watching. We'll be back with more KSP soon.